There are some distinct differences between psychopaths and sociopaths. Hi, my name is Dr. Natalie Jones. I have worked for several years in the criminal justice system and with people who are perpetrators of crimes against other people. And I'll share with you, my observations as well as like some of the classical textbook differences. So a lot of people use the terms interchangeably, psychopath, sociopath, but they're not necessarily one and the same. And even within the psychopaths and with sociopaths, in my experience in working in prison and whatnot, there is a distinct range on each spectrum. So all sociopaths aren't created equal, and all psychopaths aren't created equal as well. And there are some that are extremely dangerous that you definitely don't want to be, sort of having them walk around free and in the public. So I'll start with psychopaths first. With psychopaths, they lack empathy. They can display empathy in terms of mirroring, but they just don't. And psychopaths are born that way. And with psychopaths, they usually lack consciousness. So they just don't care how their actions affects you, and they are very intentional about hurting people, and they're very methodical. They're very skilled at blending in the population and going undetected. And some of them go undetected for forever. So they may have normal jobs like yourself and myself, but they and that's how good they are at sort of blending in and appearing to be normal, but behind closed doors, and when nobody's home, and even, just people that are intimately acquainted, they know who that person is, but they're very good at putting on a facade and appearing as though they are a normal functioning person within society. So they could be a doctor, a lawyer, judge, whatever, any profession, and they can, so what have you. But so they're very good at going undetected. With sociopaths, they're not necessarily born that way. A lot of people are, but a lot of people develop sociopathy as a trauma response. For the most part. So a lot of times they may be exposed to abusive and chaotic homes, or they are born into families that are in a life of crime or deviancy in that way. A lot of times, it's not always the case. And a lot of times with people who are antisocial or sociopathic, a lot of times they have extremely abusive parents, and so they develop what's called habituation, whereas abuse doesn't necessarily affect them anymore, or they sort of develop like their own sort of resistance to it. And so you have to be careful with that, because parents a lot of times look at that as like, oh, you're not responding to the punishment that I'm giving you, so I'm going to abuse you even more, so that you could feel some pain. And so there's that. There's also the adolescent hypothesis as it relates to sociopathy. With the adolescent hypothesis, it's basically saying that, you can have a normal functioning, normal developing child, and then somewhere along the way in adolescence, they fall into the wrong crowd. And so that's where you may have youth and juvenile that sort of get involved with gangs or peers at school that have deviant behavior. And so they develop that deviance as a response to, the modeling that's demonstrated for them. So again, it could be a trauma response, developmental response from either that deviancy of the crowd that they're falling into, or even, again, a lot of sociopaths oftentimes have parents that are sociopaths as well, or that have narcissistic personality disorder. So they could develop that. They could be biologically predisposed. Within sociopaths, if you can call it this, sociopaths have morals, or things that they wouldn't do. So a lot of times that's why you see people who have maybe like a history of like stealing and burglarizing, saying that, you know, I would do that, but I wouldn't assault a kid, you know. And so there's sort of this like this camp, you know, especially when you get into prison, where it's like, I'll do certain things, like I might, you know, do this type of crime, but I won't do that. And in fact, I will retaliate and act out amongst other people who do certain types of crimes. So that's why you may have like people who are murderers, people who are into drugs, people who have, you know, I don't know, burglarized and all this other kind of stuff, rapists even, that may act out physically and violently towards child predators once they get into prison, because it's like, that's an atrocity that I would not commit. And so this guy, he's a real criminal. I'm not a criminal. So there's sort of that, like, in a way it's a hypocrisy, but it, the other thing is like, I'm not going to go that far, and I feel like people like you deserve some sort of justice, because what you're doing is not right, and my crime is this. And a lot of times, even within that, people, sociopaths that do commit crimes, they are very aware, and they can admit to a certain degree that their crime was wrong, at least, you know, some of the people that I work with. But again, like I said, there's a spectrum within psychopathy and sociopathy. So you may have, even within sociopathy, people that are never going to admit, people that are never going to stop. The other thing is, again, research suggests that people can age out of sociopathy, where psychopathy, they pretty much have that for life. You know, there's, you know, the brain is actually shifted. So the way that their brain has developed, they're going to have that for life. Where sociopathy, there's more and more research coming out that says that, you know, people can age out of that by the time they're 40 or over. And so that basically sociopathy can go away. I'm not so sure that I believe that. I feel like, you know, at least in some of the people that I've worked with, there are always going to be some traits of that. Is it as severe as it was? Especially when, you know, they go to prison and things like that. A lot of people calm down once they're in a very structured and rigid environment. Sometimes they get worse, sometimes they don't. So my personal belief is the jury's out. I do think that some people can and do, if they're intentional about doing the work. But I do also think that there's certain elements of sociopathy that's always there, but it's not to the extreme that maybe it once was. And I personally think a lot of that is related to frontal lobe development. You know, if you know anything about the brain, the frontal lobe, for most people, doesn't stop developing until about 29, 30 years old. So I think and that's responsible for like impulse control, like responsibilities, doing the daily activities that you're supposed to do. So that's why there's a lot of controversy around child and juvenile convictions, because the frontal lobe isn't fully developed. And a lot of people argue that it's unconstitutional to convict a child because they're not in control of their impulsivity by that time. But yeah, so I personally think a lot of what that research is actually indicating is like frontal lobe development. And so impulse control, plus you add into it a structured or a rigid environment that's very controlled, then that's when you see people start to calm down or slow down on impulse control. The other thing that I think also happens is that people become more skilled in criminal activity, and therefore they're not as likely to get caught. Hopefully that helps, and this isn't comprehensive, but that's just some of the stuff from my experience. Thanks for watching.